Good morning, Faith Community. I want to continue our series on why read the Bible. It's so important that we understand that God's Word is worth spending time in. But more than spending time in His Word, what I want to challenge you to do today is to meditate on God's Word. God's Word is designed for us to meditate on it. The psalmist says this in Psalm 119, verse 15. He says, I will meditate on your precepts and think about your ways. What do you spend time meditating on? Do you meditate? What does that mean? To meditate means to think deeply. And I want to start out with a word of warning. You see, we live in a culture that doesn't value depth of thought. We live in a culture that has a high value on amusement. As a matter of fact, we have such a high value on amusement that we see it as a necessity, as an essential right. We need to be amused. It blows me away when I see a poor, rundown house with a satellite dish on top. When I hear from people that they're having trouble paying their bills, but they can still pay their cable bill or their internet bill. You know, amusement is not essential. What amusement means, that word muse means to think. Amuse means not thinking. We have a culture that values not thinking, that values unplugging their brains. We have so many modern conveniences, and if you look at them and you pay attention, you'll realize many of those modern conveniences are designed to enable us not to think. I don't need to memorize phone numbers anymore because they're all stored in my phone. I don't need to spend time memorizing much of anything. And because of that, I don't spend very much time thinking deeply. As a school teacher, I would often challenge my students to think deeply about things, and they would get frustrated, and they would tell me, you're the teacher, you're supposed to tell us the answer, or you're supposed to tell us how to do it. And I would challenge them constantly to think deeply, and I realized I was up against a society that's teaching us it's good to not think. It's good to just accept information, to not think critically or deeply about it. That does a disservice when we come to God's Word. God's Word is to be meditated upon. We are to think deeply about God's Word. Listen to the psalmist. He says this in Psalm 119, verse 23. Though princes sit together speaking against me, your servant will think about your statutes. What do you do when people are gossiping about you? When people are saying evil about you? Do you stop and meditate on God's Word, or do you obsess about what people are saying about you? He says this in verse 27, help me understand the meaning of your precepts so I can meditate on your wonders. You know, on Monday I told you the Lord Himself teaches you His Word. Do you understand that the desire to be taught by God is so I can meditate more on Him? I want Him to reveal Himself to me so I can spend more time thinking about Him, meditating on His ways. Verse 45 says this, I will walk freely in an open place because I study your precepts. You know, freedom in living your life for God comes from a deep study of His Word. Verse 48 says this, I will lift up my hands to your commands, which I love, and I will meditate on your statutes. You know, that meditation flows out of love. When you love God's Word, it fills your mind. It captivates your attention. Something that I found is that we remember what we value. Now, I would get frustrated sometimes with my students as a teacher when they could remember all of these facts about movies or sports or video games. They could rattle off all this information that they'd stored in their brain that they couldn't remember one formula in math. But what I realized is they didn't value that. They didn't see value in it, so they didn't think about it. They didn't spend the time thinking about it or meditating on it, so it didn't stick. You meditate on what you love. Yesterday, I shared with you God's Word is a delight. As you delight in it, it's going to drive your love of it. Verse 78 says this, let the arrogant be put to shame for slandering me with lies. I will meditate on your precepts. Verse 97, he says, "How I love your instruction. It is my meditation all day long. Your commands make me wiser than my enemies, for they are always with me. I have more insight than all my teachers because your decrees are my meditation. I understand more than the elders because I obey your precepts." David says, I love your instruction. That's why I meditate. The way of life is revealed to David as he spends time thinking deeply about God's word. You know, what's amazing to me is oftentimes we don't spend time thinking deeply about God's word because of life, because we think that we have to spend so much time on our lives, on the busyness of life, when the way of life is revealed through meditation on God's word. Verse 148 says this, "I am awake through each watch of the night to meditate on your promise." Read God's word enough so that when you wake up in the middle of the night and you can't go to sleep, you can contemplate in your mind things that you read that day, things that you're studying in his word, things that you're meditating on in his word. Take time to meditate. Don't buy into the lie of our society that it's not good to think deeply. Think deeply about God's word. Meditate. It reveals to you the way of life. Thank you so much for listening to me today.